Ladies and gentlemen, to the second session of the conference, which is actually the first session if you look at your programme, but we won't go into that. We had a splendid first session. And before I start this one, could I just say just a personal word? If you look at the back page of your programme, there is a list of the organising committee, and somebody, without my consent or any discussion, has put my name at the top of it. That is entirely inappropriate. The hard work that was done to get this show on the road was done by Michael Keating and Guy Laforêt. And I would like to say, on behalf of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and indeed of the Royal Society of Canada, how much I appreciate the amount of work that went in to bringing this conference together. It's never an easy thing to do, and especially when it's being done internationally. So I'd just like to put on record my thanks to you, Michael, and to you, Guy, for getting us to a point where we have such a splendid programme and a splendid list of speakers, two of whom are about to speak to us in this session. Professor Keith Banting from Queen's University in Ontario, Professor Nicola McEwen from the University of Edinburgh. All the details of the speakers are in your programme, so I'm not going to read them out. The pattern will be the same as the first session, a maximum of half an hour from each speaker. Keith has asked me to give him a signal well before that so that he knows where he's going. I will give both speakers will get a tap on my glass at 5 minutes before the half hour is up. We will then have a minimum of half an hour for questions and discussion. Our subject in this is the very fraught and, I think, intellectually challenging one of welfare. And I think it will be very useful, certainly to me and to, I think, a lot of people in Scotland, to get an international comparative perspective on what is one of the more challenging political policy issues, public policy issues of our time. Keith, can I turn over to you, please?
I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in what looks like it's going to be a fascinating conference. I'd also like to thank them for very personal reasons. My mother was born and raised in this city. She married my father at the end of the Second World War. He was in the Canadian Air Force. And so I have roots here, and it's always fun to come back to Edinburgh and explore my roots. My mother's family were sculptors, and so a number of the statues and war memorials in this city are by her family, and so we spent a very pleasant day yesterday exploring our roots. The topic today I've chosen is inequality and decentralization in Canada, and I'm addressing here two of the big trends in Canadian life in recent years. Canada has, as with many other countries, seen a significant increase in inequality. We are among the OECD countries in which inequality has grown the most, not as much as in the United States, but certainly slightly more so than in the UK. And this has been a pattern which has significantly changed, I think, the social contract in the country. The other big fact about Canada is that it is a decentralized federation, has always been, and has become more decentralized recently. And the more recent decentralization took place at about the same time as the big jump in inequality. And the question I want to ask is, are these two trends related? We know that federalism is an instrument which has important advantages. It's a mechanism by which countries, particularly divided ethnically or culturally divided countries, or to use Michael's phrase, plurinational nations or plurinational countries, can accommodate cultural difference. We know that federations move decision-making closer to citizens. But is there a price to be paid for decentralization in terms of the capacity of systems to generate relatively fair societies in terms of the gap between rich and poor? That's the kind of question I want to explore with you a bit this morning. So my outline is relatively simple. I'm going to just give you some bare facts about the growth in inequality and the decline of redistribution in Canada. I then will give you some bare facts on decentralization in the country. And then I'll ask, are these trends related? And I'm going to consider two separate hypotheses. One is a very traditional one an argument you can find in a number of sources, a number of types of literature, which argues that decentralization produces weaker redistribution, which produces greater inequality. There's a second hypothesis, a newer hypothesis in the literature, which I also want to at least open up. I'm not sure I'm going to have as much to say about this one, that greater inequality is actually the driver at work here, and that inequality leads to decentralization, which in turn leads to weaker redistribution. So I'm going to try and come at it from these two different directions. Which way is the causal process working, in effect? Part one, inequality and redistribution in Canada. Canada has experienced a growth in the top 1%, the proportion of income captured by the top 1% of income earners. We are second only to the United States in the extent to which that is the case. We rival the UK in that regard. And in this you can see the proportion of income in the period 1975 to 2007, which has been captured by the top 1%. That's in the yellow or orange bars. You can see largest in the United States, second largest in Canada, third largest in the United Kingdom. The drivers of this growth and inequality are complex. Much has to do with the operations of the economy, changing norms governing executive compensation, what the economists call skill-biased technological change, polarization of jobs and a shrinking of the middle class or middle class occupations, a decline in union density in the country and weakening of collective bargaining, and assortative mating, which is the economist's phrase for the tendency of highly skilled people to marry highly skilled people and less skilled people to marry less skilled people, which becomes a force multiplier in the sense that growth in family inequality in family incomes is greater than the growth of inequality in individual incomes, because this tendency of like to marry like or to partner with like tends to reinforce that pattern. So there are lots of reasons why inequality has grown, and those reasons are similar in Canada as they are in the UK or the US, throughout the OECD. But one second or another driver has been the weakening of the role of government in altering the distribution of income that has been generated by the private sector or by the market. And we have seen in Canada a reduction in the redistributive impact of the state. We've seen a retrenchment in the social envelope in terms of a decline in social spending as a proportion of GDP, retrenchment in income transfers, particularly in the mid-1990s. And I want you to remember that date, the mid-1990s, because a lot went on in Canada in that period. We've also seen a decline in public revenues as a proportion of GDP. We've had an emphasis on tax cuts, and we have had moved towards a less progressive income tax system. A couple of charts which capture this trend. This is total public social expenditures as a proportion of GDP, and I've put a number of countries here to illustrate the patterns throughout Europe, but this cluster here, what comparative welfare state theorists call liberal welfare states, as you can see, Canada in the 1990s was about the same as the UK and well ahead of the US. If you roll the story forward to 2014, this is an estimate from the OECD, it's not final numbers, you can see that Canada has been remarkably stable. The UK and the US have pulled ahead of Canada in the proportion of their national resources they are devoting to social policy. This is partly a reflection of the lower effect of the shallower recession in Canada, but I think in the 2008 recession affected us less. But I think this number is actually telling us something real. We're getting back to an equilibrium position. And not many Canadians think of themselves as living in a society that spends less on social policy than the United States, but it's true. Tax revenues. This is a complicated graph. I apologize if it can't be read easily at the back of the room. This shows public revenues, government revenues, as a proportion of GDP, and this is the Canadian line. This is the US line. These other lines are OECD quartiles, so what this is telling us is that public expenditure as a proportion, public revenues as a proportion of GDP were at the OECD average in 1992 and have now moved down to something much closer to the bottom quartile of OECD countries. We just have far fewer public revenue, much reduced public revenue to pursue government objectives. This is a standard measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, and you can see the Gini is simply a measure of inequality. The higher the number, the higher level of inequality. This runs from 1976 to 2010, and you can see that in the 1980s, there was a big jump in inequality in market income. The income that Canadians derive from participation in the market, particularly wages, rental income, interest income, all forms of market income. Big jump in inequality in the 1980s. Another jump in the early 1990s. Relative stability since then, a little uptick in the later part of the 2000s. This bottom line is inequality after government taxes and transfers are in place. And what this tells us is that up until about 1995, there's that year again, 1995, government transfers, taxes and transfers were largely offsetting the growth in inequality in the country. Big jump in inequality here, stability here. Taxes and transfers were doing their job, offsetting growth inequality in the country, in the market, but after that, it tends to track rather than offset. That is, inequality was growing faster than the transfer system could cope with, especially because there were cuts. Point one. Point two, decentralization. Canada has always been, in social policy, a relatively decentralized country and has become more so. My friend Guy Laforêt will quickly say there are other dimensions of Canadian life which have become more centralized through the Charter of Rights and so on, but in the social policy domain, it's clear Canada has been a relatively decentralized system with the predominant role carried by provinces. In the post-war period, Canada became a relatively or semi-centralized welfare state, and the federal government played the predominant role in the expansion of social programs in the post-war period. But since then, there has been a long, steady process of decentralization of social programs. This is simply a quick, simple one indicator of that. Big growth, this is starting in the 1930s. This is 33, I think. So big growth in the federal level of expenditure in the system as a whole in the war and then post-war era. Long, slow decline to the mid-70s. Then relative stability for 2 decades. And then there's that year 1995 again, beginning of a drop down in the federal proportion of total spending and a move up in the provincial and local spending. There were a whole range of reasons why in the social policy domain particular decisions were made which decentralized more. I don't think I have time to develop each one of these. I can come back and talk about the details excuse me, in questions, but the pattern in the mid-90s, in the 90s and was to decentralize a number of social programs, either generally or in the case of, say, maternity and paternity benefits, to Quebec in an asymmetrical form of decentralization. One of the results is, if you look at this comparatively, Canada is one of the most decentralized of welfare states. This chart comes from a book, a comparative book by Obinger, Leifried, and Castles, which simply tracks jurisdiction, and it shows that the provincial level has more formal jurisdiction to set the legislative structure of social programs in Canada than in other OECD welfare states. We rival the United States in this regard, slightly more decentralized than the United States, much more decentralized in terms of authority over the parameters of social policy than in European welfare states, federal welfare states. And here we have the other important thing which is relevant to this is that the fiscal system is also quite decentralized. Here's direct public spending, something we've already touched on. Own source revenues, very importantly, are much higher in Canada much lower. This is the federal share. Own source revenues are much lower in Canada. Implicitly, own source revenues at the provincial local level are more important. Federal transfers as a proportion of total revenues of other levels of government, 15%. What that tells you is that provinces have significant fiscal autonomy to operate. They may not have enough revenue, but they have considerable autonomy in the way resources are raised. Okay, quick intro to two big trends: inequality, decentralization. Are they related? Or did they just happen to happen? Did it just happen that they happened at the same time? Is there anything causal going on here? Hypothesis one, this is the very traditional hypothesis in the literature that decentralization leads to weaker redistribution and greater inequality. There are many factors underpinning the decentralization of social programming. Let's say, I'm going to concentrate on the more recent period. Public finances were a major problem in Canada, and ideological shifts, I think, were important to this process as well. But was decentralization an additional driver of the reduction in redistribution? And here I'm going to take a minute to say that there are several bodies of literature which argue it is the case, that decentralized systems make it more difficult to redistribute than more centralized systems. Comparative studies of the welfare state argue that institutions matter in this regard. People who study the relative restructuring of welfare states across the OECD as a whole tend to argue that forces like globalization and neoliberalism tended to have the greatest impact in countries with an institutional structure which fragmented power. So federalism, and a first-past-the-post electoral system, a variety of institutional structures were important, and those countries which had that more fragmented form of power tended to have more restructuring, more retrenchment, a lower level of redistribution than in the past. And others like Paul Pearson and Kent Weaver argue that federalism allows for blame avoidance in a restructuring moment. That is to say that the federal government can cut transfers to lower levels and avoid blame for the kind of chaos that can ensue or the pain that follows at the provincial level. There are also comparative studies of fiscal federalism by people like Roden and others, who argue that what is critical is the structure of fiscal intergovernmental fiscal relations in terms of transfers to provinces and the conditions under which they happen. The literature is very diverse. This says there isn't a simple correlation between federalism and redistribution, but it does say that where the central government has the control of raising the money and transfers the resources to the lower levels, those systems actually, if anything, the state gets bigger. But those systems which are highly decentralized, where the local units have to raise their own money, are particularly vulnerable to the constraints of inter-regional competition, tax competition in particular, and that those governments have tended to be more restrained. And Canada falls into that second category, as I've just said. So there are a number of bodies of literature which say there is this relationship out there. And so the question is, can you see any traces of these in the adjustments that went on in Canada in recent years? I think there is some evidence. Certainly there's evidence of the sort of emphasis by people like Weaver and Pearson on downloading. The federal budget of 1995 was a critical moment in retrenchment, and provincial governments regularly point out that the federal government cut its transfers to the provinces more than it cut its own social spending, or its own expenditure levels. And so there was a kind of ease in transferring the burden to lower levels of government, which then cascaded down to municipal governments, which depend on provinces for their transfers. So I think you can see some of that. The other important bit of evidence here is that there was a larger decline in redistribution at the provincial level than at the federal level. Federal cuts in unemployment benefits were large, but they were offset by an expansion of child benefits in this period. Provincial cuts in social assistance, on the other hand, were significant and driven largely by program administrative changes at the local level and not offset by other forms of investment in redistribution. Now, that's one of the patterns that emerged in this period. The other pattern was a clear, expanded scope for interprovincial variation and redistribution, and we see significant variation in the country, across the country, with Quebec being a significant outlier. These are figures which show the decline in social assistance at the provincial level, and I don't think, how am I doing for time? Okay, well, so I'll take a moment. I'm undoubtedly going to run out of time. This is the black line here. These are provincial social assistance programs. This is the average for Canada as a whole. As you can see, social assistance beneficiaries rose steadily through this period, and then about 1995, point of cascading cuts, dramatic reductions in the the proportion of the population in receipt of social assistance benefits. And economists estimate about 1/3 of this was improvement in the economy, and 2/3 of it was the result of program changes at the provincial level. This is benefit levels, and you can see they peak again in 1995. This is the average of benefit levels for a single parent with one child. You can see they track down steadily over time, continuing downward to 2003. So that's the sort of a picture of some of the general cuts at the provincial level. But, and here I want to talk a bit about variation within the country and start with the position of Quebec. At the time that Quebec, and here I'm drawing very heavily on a chapter by Alain Noël. I'm basically cycling him here, and he's done a very nice job of analyzing the politics in Quebec. At the same time, Canada as a whole and the rest of the rest of the provinces were moving to the right. Quebec moved to the left. It moved to the left in part because of its internal politics, a much more, what Alain calls a more strongly organized society, more powerful trade unions, stronger women's movement, stronger students' movement we've seen more recently, a dense network of social advocacy organizations, and perhaps a more collectivist culture, although Alain puts the emphasis more on organizational politics than cultural politics. What is important is that in addition to its internal politics, under the Federation, it turned out that Quebec had substantial jurisdictional and fiscal capacity to chart a new course. Indeed, in one of Alain's papers, he actually says he was surprised by the extent to which the system accommodated a different structure. And that is in part because the system generally is decentralized. Quebec has an asymmetric position that is more decentralized in the case of Quebec in pensions, in fiscal relations, I'll come back to that, in maternity, paternity benefits. It has a significant share of tax room, and under the Canadian system, provinces can change not just the rate, but the base. They can change exemptions. They can change credits. And that was very important to Quebec because it changed the exemptions for childcare, private expenditures in childcare, eliminated them from the provincial tax to provide funding for a universal childcare system. And they were able to change the exemptions of benefit structure to produce a stronger system of child benefits. So it was that they have both jurisdiction and fiscal room or fiscal freedom, which is in many federations not available. And Nicola will speak to the question of the Scottish, how much Scottish room there is. And so Quebec chose a different path. There were a set of it was partly the result of post-referendum politics. PQ government had just lost on its nationalist agenda, that therefore emphasized its social democratic nature in trying to maintain a mobilized and active party in the late 1990s. And it was in this period that they cut social assistance, just like the other provinces. There's a Quebec line in that graph I showed in the number of people receiving social assistance in the province. It parallels the other provinces exactly. But they, unlike the other provinces, engaged in compensating redistributive practices, including universal child care, a significant expansion of child tax credits, more active labor market policies, an anti-poverty program, and higher income taxes. Half of the redistributive impact flows from taxes. So this is just capturing some of the results. This is poverty trends in Canada as a whole and Quebec. So there's the pattern for Canada. You see a drop in poverty, and this was particularly the case among single women in Quebec, whose labor market participation rose dramatically, sufficiently that the government, it actually paid for the costs of the child care program. And this is inequality between Ontario and Quebec. Quebecers tend to, when they compare themselves, tend to think that they should compare themselves to Ontario generally. And you can see this is the pattern of inequality in Ontario, tracking the general pattern I showed earlier, and this is the pattern in Quebec. So clearly the system accommodated diversity, or at least an outlier, in the case of Quebec. But when we look at the rest of the provinces, we do not see the same pattern. We see, however, a large policy range. And what is important for this purpose is that range is stable over time. There's not been a pressure for convergence across the provinces. So there's a quote from a chapter by Rodney Haddo: Quebec's redistribution exceeded that of Alberta, the least redistributive province, by 35 points in 2000 and 2007, about 3/4 of the gap between Europe's most generous welfare states and the US. So you put Sweden here, you put United States here, big gap. The Canadian provinces, variation is about 3/4 of that. So we're talking about a society with a stunningly diverse approach to social policy across the provinces. It is a country which has been comfortable with great variation in what other countries would call social citizenship benefits over time. We're more comfortable with variation in social citizenship than many other federal states. Excuse me. No evidence of convergence reflects, and these differences reflect provincial patterns. This is probably an indecipherable chart. All it shows is the extent to which each province reduced inequality in 1993, 2000, 2007. Quebec comes out at the very top, and if you, by 2007, here's Alberta at 11, Quebec at 47, that's a multiple of 4, obviously. This is a serious variation across time, across time and space. Slight decline in the mean, which means that there was a general easing or reduction of redistribution. So the system was, in a sense, differences were stable even if the system was sliding a little in total.
5 minutes.
Okay, hypothesis 1. This is the traditional logic, the traditional argument about redistribution in federal welfare states. I think it probably is true that decentralization facilitated greater variation in redistribution across the country. We've seen, I think that's there in spades, and it has not. The important point is that there isn't a kind of relentless competition between provinces which drives them to some low-level mean. There's not a race to the bottom going on here. There's stable variation reflecting stable political preferences. On the second, on the decentralization, I think it's probably fair to say that decentralization contributed to declining redistribution generally. They happened at devolution and inequality, happened at the same time. Downloading was important. And redistribution, even with Quebec in, redistribution was greater, the decline in redistribution was greater at the provincial than federal level. Hypothesis 2 is going to be really rushed. You thought I was talking fast. Here the argument is, let's run the relationship the other way. Maybe inequality was going up, and that was that led to decentralization, and that led to reduced redistribution. Now, no one would claim that decentralization in Canada is driven by inequality across the country as a whole. Clearly, cultural explanations are really important in explaining the Canadian federal system. But what's growing inequality, an additional driver, driving decentralization. And there's a new literature emerging among political economists. Baramendi is a political scientist, but is in this tradition, who argues the traditional causal logic underpinning the links between decentralization, redistribution, and inequality might be very well reversed. It's not that decentralization causes inequality, but rather that pre-existing economic inequalities drive decentralization of the welfare state, which in turn reproduces the pre-existing pattern of inequality. Or another, at the extreme, federalism facilitates the survival of democracies with high levels of interregional income inequality. If you had real regional income inequality, big time, a democratic state might not survive if it was unified, and federalism allows for that variation. I'm going to skip over this. It's a complex logic that is set out, but basically argues that poorer regions, both the poor and the rich in poorer regions, have a preference for some form of redistribution across the system as a whole. But in rich regions, both the poor and the rich in rich regions prefer decentralized welfare state. This is just done on the basis of pure economic logic. It's not a measure of preferences, but the economic, for a poor person to maximize his or her well-being, better to have a decentralized system if you're in a rich province. Is a kind of logic at work. I'll skip over quickly. Now, I actually think, and I haven't actually finished this paper yet. In fact, the paper is in the process of becoming. But what is interesting is I don't think you can find an argument which says that growing interregional inequality in average income across provinces drove drove decentralization in the mid-1990s because it was relatively stable. That is, the pattern of regional economic inequality was relatively stable in the 1980s and 90s. So there wasn't a pre-existing surge in regional inequality, which then led to decentralization and more inequality. You can't find that pattern, but you do in the 2000s, largely because of the resource boom. And so whether you measure it with standard deviation or high-low ratios, it's very clear that the parts of the country were pulling away from each other economically. And I think this is likely an important part of the explanation of why equalization is under such stress in Canada today. The Equalization Program is a program which is designed to not equalize, but to help poorer provinces maintain comparable levels of services at comparable levels of taxation. It's a transfer system between, in effect, rich and poor areas of the country. It's a weak system compared to the OECD, but it has been an important part of certainly our psychology, and it's been our national psychology, and it's been an important part of our program structure. And in the 1990 and 2000, it has come under immense pressure. We have moved from a principled basis, and I'll explain what this means in detail if you're interested in the conversation afterwards. We put a cap on the total amount. The resource boom drove inequalities much further apart. Ontario became a recipient, and since there's a cap and you add a big claimant, that meant that transfers to other poor provinces declined in absolute terms, and we have seen the growth of considerable political controversy. So this just shows you that it's weak compared to other systems. I'll concentrate here. You can see these are the regional disparities over time. It tracks it from the 1970s through to the 2000s. And you can see a big spike in the resource boom of the late 1970s, then relatively flat, and then growth again with the new resource boom here. This is regional disparity after the Equalization Program, so it's lower, so it's helping, but you can see it's tracking up again, which means that disparity after equalization is growing in the country. This slide shows you, this is the percent of disparity reduced. As you can see, over time, about 45% has been eliminated. It's varied over time. During resource booms, it tends to be weaker, stronger in periods, other periods, and as you can see, it's tracking down again. That is, the proportion of disparities among regions is growing after, or the Equalization Program is not working as strongly as it did in the past. Conclusions? Do I have time for conclusions, sir? I think the Hearst hypothesis, there's some weak evidence. I wouldn't put this as a strong factor driving decentralization and the reduction of inequality in Canada. Sorry, I wouldn't make a strong case for decentralization being a primary factor, but I think it was perhaps a secondary factor in the level of decentralization that emerged and the inequality that emerged thereafter. I think that it probably did facilitate it, but it didn't generate dynamics which made interprovincial variation in social choices impossible. They persisted over time, and there was no evidence here of provinces being driven to some low common denominator. On the second one, I think, does inequality lead to decentralization, to weaker redistribution? Here, I think the evidence is a little more mixed. Probably not. I don't think it contributed to retrenchment in the 1990s, but I think it's weakening inequality in the 2000s. Had I more time, I was going to talk about future prospects, because I've been talking about an era in which all the political pressures were retrenchment pressure oriented, right? From the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s. We're in a new period where inequality has become a political issue, and parties at both the provincial and federal level are starting to move gently forward. And I'll just say you can start to see movement at the provincial level on minimum wages, on social assistance benefit levels, not on the number of people being assisted, but on benefit levels, and a little bit on taxation of higher income Canadians. We're starting to see a bit of movement. And we'll see after October, whatever it is, which approach to inequality prevails in the federal election. So I may in the paper have more to say about the future, but I can expand in discussions. Thank you very much.
Keith, thanks very much indeed. I think it's likely from conversations over coffee that Nicola will be looking forward the possibilities of change in the UK. Nicola.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you today. It's a pleasure. It's also a particular pleasure for me to share a platform with Keith Banting. I first met Keith many, many years ago when I was a PhD student in doing some research in Canada, and Keith was enormously generous of time with me and has been hugely influential on my own work. So it's a pleasure to share this with you. As Alan said, I'm interested in particular in trying to think through the new social security competences in the Scotland Bill, which is currently going through the legislative process in the UK. So I'm necessarily a little bit more speculative than Keith was, but we'll touch on some similar issues and maybe feed off of some of the things that Keith was saying in his presentation. This Scotland Bill takes devolution into a new phase. It's a significant new step in the journey because it's moving beyond those policy fields which were, for many, many years prior to devolution, under the executive competence of the old Scottish Office. So it's moving us into new territory, new policy territory, which I think creates perhaps some new challenges, perhaps also some new opportunities. In the UK, unlike in Canada, social security in particular has been a very centralised domain, at least in the post-war period. So we don't have that history of decentralisation to draw upon, but we seem to be moving a little bit more into that direction. So the key questions that I want to ask are, first of all, to look at the welfare competences in the Scotland Bill 2015, to consider what scope that they will offer for social security decentralisation. And then, because I'm a political scientist and I look for the problems and the challenges, to try to identify the administrative, financial and constitutional constraints that I think will shape and condition the extent to which a distinctive social security regime perhaps can be developed within Scotland that will shape the options that will face the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. And then to think more broadly about the implications of what we might think of as a partial rescaling of social welfare for broader concerns of UK social citizenship, interregional solidarity, and what has been termed in broader political debate as the social union. And I'll start there a little bit, to take a step back, first of all, and think about the way in which the welfare state, broadly defined, has been linked to ideas of nationhood, of citizenship, of solidarity, which within politics and also within the literature, actually, that has tended to be assumed to be a form of nationhood which matches the boundaries of the state. I've always liked the idea put forward by Ramesh Mishra, who talked about the development of the welfare state as being part and parcel of the development of the nation state. It was in some ways a manifestation of the nation state in its heyday, consolidating the national community economically, politically, and socially. And in the UK, in particular, there was a very influential contribution way back at the end of the 1940s by T.H. Marshall, where he talked about the evolution of citizenship rights and the idea that social citizenship was an extension, a gradual evolution of citizenship from civil rights to democratic rights, culminating in the social rights of citizenship. The idea that citizens are equal in their status, irrespective of their position in society or the economy, irrespective of their class or income position, but they had an equality of status as citizens, and that was the basis of solidarity. That entitled them to an equitable right to healthcare, to education, social security, and so on. And that equitable access was in turn a reflection of and a basis for the solidarity among citizens. Now that was a point of view, a perspective that was much criticized, particularly when you try to put it into a broader comparative perspective. Many critics suggested that it didn't quite capture the struggles that had often been inherent in the acquisition of those social rights of citizenship, that it didn't always work in that evolutionary model that Marshall had suggested. But nonetheless, this was a powerful myth of citizenship, of solidarity, of nationhood associated with the modern post-war welfare state. And it's much less evident now at that nation-state level because in the last 2 decades, in a sense, the welfare state and social security in particular has come to be seen more as a burden in light of demographic changes than as an inherent right to be celebrated. Except perhaps in Scotland, where the myth of social citizenship has endured in broader political debates. Now, I'm calling it a myth. That's not a judgment of its truth or falsehood. I think there's elements of both in there, but it's been a powerful narrative in an aspect of political debate within Scotland, and epitomised, I did say to Jim Gallagher I was going to quote him in the presentation, but epitomised in this paragraph, I think, from the Kalman Commission report of 2009, which was an illustration of this idea of the social rights of citizenship and the bonds of citizenship and nationhood and solidarity. There are many social ties that bind the UK together, but here talking now specifically about social security payments, because of course most of the rest of the welfare state was already devolved, but social security payments are available and paid on the same basis to people across the country according to their needs. And hinting in this last bit at the time that perhaps there might also be a case for some sort of framework within which other devolved social welfare services might be provided so as to maintain that sense of equitable access across the UK as an entitlement of citizenship. Now, within the UK, as I said, the welfare state, the social security system in particular, has been very centralised, but only really in the post-war period in association with its expansion. Prior to that, it was more possible to make a distinction, very common in other countries to make a distinction between social security in terms of unemployment insurance, employment insurance, and benefits and those redistributive aspects, and then social assistance, on the other hand, is often carved out as a distinctive policy sphere and much more frequently found to be at the lower level of government. In the UK, we've never really made that distinction, at least since the post-war welfare state, and social security developed as a very nationalised, very centralised system. In the 1998 Scotland Act, the devolution legislation, there was a specific reservation which continued to reserve social security, quoted as schemes supported from central or local funds which provide assistance for social security purposes. So social security payments was specifically reserved to the Westminster Parliament by the founding legislation of the Scottish Parliament. So redistributive powers, essentially through both the welfare system and the tax system, broadly remained reserved. Everything else associated with the welfare state and those broader rights of citizenship were, by default, devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Just before I move on to that, I mean, the consequences of the devolution of a variety of different areas of welfare state was that we started to see divergences in the entitlements of citizenship. If you think of it in broad terms, so the services available, the social services available to people living in Scotland compared to people living in other parts of the UK have become really quite distinctive and really quite divergent, with a preference and a prevalence for universal provision north of the border, which hasn't always been the case in some of those service areas in the rest of the UK. So you start to already see divergent social citizenship, if you like. There's also greater obvious interdependencies between those areas that were reserved and those areas that were devolved. So you have issues like housing benefit remaining a responsibility of the reserved Westminster Parliament, and housing services or housing provision being part of the devolved basket of powers. And there are obvious interdependencies across the sphere of social policy between those areas reserved and those devolved. And the third thing to say here is that some policy problems just defy the constitutional division of powers, however you carve it out. So if you want government to address poverty and inequality, well, that isn't really something that you can carve out as being a responsibility of one level or another. So it necessitated, at the very least, some joint working and collaboration between the two governments, intended to expose the jagged edges between what was the responsibility of one level and the responsibility of another. But even before we get to the new legislation, there's already been a changing constitutional and a changing political landscape around the issue of social welfare. The Scotland Act 2012, not yet fully implemented, was already bringing new fiscal powers and increase in fiscal autonomy. And at the UK level, the Welfare Reform Act of 2012 has introduced a barrage of welfare reforms which have raised the issue of social welfare and inequality much higher up the political agenda than it perhaps had been before. Ostensibly an attempt to simplify the social security system, also an attempt to reduce the social security budget, and some very controversial aspects of that, which are most notably and symbolically expressed in what's become known as the bedroom tax for the purposes of Canadian colleagues. This was officially called a spare room subsidy, so an additional penalty for those claiming housing benefits who had an additional room that was seen as additional to their needs. And also accompanied with a tightened, a stricter sanctions regime, whereby you had to meet a stricter set of conditions to be deemed eligible for receipt of benefits. At the same time, we also had a very small example of what Keith referred to as offloading, when the UK government essentially abandoned or abolished a small pot of welfare provision around crisis and support grants for people in desperate short-term needs, and devolved that responsibility to the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and local authorities in England, but with a 10% cut in their budget. So it's a small element of what you were referring to here. But what we've seen too in Scotland is the way that welfare reform and the political response to it was subsumed within the broader debate about territorial politics, about the Constitution, and about where responsibility and decision-making authority should lie. And that was evident within the referendum campaign last year. And what I think is striking about, I've given you the sort of traditional predominantly Labour view of social union and of the social solidarity aspects, that social citizenship aspect expressed again, where the union, the political union, the United Kingdom was defended as a union for social justice, where you can have that sort of solidarity across the boundaries of the UK as a whole, or on the other side, where independence was seen as a tool, a mechanism for achieving social solidarity within Scotland. And one of the things that I think is striking about those two contributions is that they're essentially making the same case. They're using the welfare state as, if I can quote Keith Banting here, they're using the welfare state as statecraft in a way, using it for territorial goals. The difference is the boundaries within which that's conceived. So the boundaries in the one case are the United Kingdom, the boundaries in the other case are Scotland. So, moving on then to think about the next stage, the next phase of devolution, where we will have a partial devolution of some social security, and I'll look in more detail in a moment at what that will be. But my first 3 bullet points here, Keith has already covered very well around what some of the literature suggests as some of the negative effects that there may be if you have a multi-level government or a federalisation or a devolution of social security, potentially increasing the number of veto points that could slow the development of statewide provision, potentially introducing an element of competition, particularly through the tax system, that can generate pressures for a race to the bottom, and potentially through these divergences that would emerge, weakening the basis of solidarity and weakening the support for redistribution between richer and poorer regions. There's another set of potential effects identified more within the nationalism and territorial politics literature, which would suggest that actually you could have positive effects. If you have, particularly in the case of a state which has strong territorial identities at a lower level, or a plurinational state, if you like, then you may already have that greater solidarity at the sub-state level that can boost support for a more progressive and more redistributive system. You could potentially, and this has been evident at times in the Canadian case, but you could potentially have this situation where welfare expansion is seen as a route to compete for the solidarity, compete for the attachment of citizens, where there is a competitive nation-building process going on to try to maintain a union or national unity. And you could also conversely have the idea that if you are able to develop policy at a lower scale, it might be easier to experiment. And through policy experimentation, you can have subsequent transfer of policy. If it works in one level, then perhaps then it's easier to transfer and make it work in another. And if it fails, then you know not to go there. So, which is the likely outcome, if any, of the new powers in social security in the Scotland Bill? Well, first of all, let's have a look at these. Really, they're mainly in the area of what elsewhere might be described as social assistance. The biggest element of the powers to be devolved are around disability living allowance, to be transitioned into personal independence payments, and also some benefits for carers, and some benefits in what are collectively known as the Regulated Social Fund. So it's around about £2.5 billion, roughly, 5 minutes, in current estimations, which I think is about 13 or 14% of overall social security spend in Scotland. There will also be additional executive powers and flexibilities around the administration of universal credit, which is the big working age benefit and credit for those who are seeking work or in low-paid work, and an opportunity to change the housing element of that so as to do away with the bedroom tax if that is so desired. And some additional powers in the area of active labour market policy. A disputed power over new benefits in areas of devolved responsibility, with a dispute as to what that actually means, and a power to top up payments to reserved benefits with conditions there. And significantly, a devolution of income tax rates and thresholds for earned income, and I'll come back to that. But I want to emphasize the constraints. I think there are a number of reasons why the devolution of social security powers in Scotland are unlikely to create the kind of flexibilities that Keith talked about that have been evident in the case of Quebec. Even if there is a desire to develop a significantly distinctive social security regime in Scotland, I think the capacity is not yet there. There are legislative constraints. The Scotland Bill 2015 doesn't devolve social security functions, it devolves social security benefits. And I think that's a crucial distinction because it brings constraints around what you can do with entitlements in the scope of benefits. There are also some additional constraints on the criteria and the flexibilities. There are some potential institutional constraints too. It's not clear yet whether the Scottish Government will decide to set up its own bureaucracy for the delivery of these welfare benefits, or whether it will share a UK-wide bureaucracy. Clearly, if you set up your own, it's very costly, but potentially brings more flexibility. If you share a bureaucracy, then you have to share much more than just the offices. I think that brings its own constraints on what you can then do with it. There will be a continued and indeed even an enhanced interdependence between what's devolved and what's reserved because of the integrated nature of the social security system. So if you change entitlement at one level, it can have a knock-on effect for entitlements to benefits at another level. And those complexities will be enormously difficult to manage if you start to see systems try to diverge. So there will be pressures, I think, to maintain a degree of commonality, not least to make it less difficult than it already is from a user's perspective. There are significant financial constraints. Demographic constraints, of course, affect all advanced democratic states are facing, or most of them at least, are facing an aging population. And in this case, as my colleague David Bell has worked out, around half of the benefits to be devolved in the Scotland Bill are for people who are in the retired age bracket. So the burden in those areas that are devolved is likely to increase as the population ages and as the dependency ratios change over time as well. There will be difficulties in working out how to finance welfare through continued fiscal transfers and adjustments to the block grant, which are not yet clear how that will be worked out. And although there is a significant increase in fiscal autonomy, it will not allow the same flexibilities that have been evident in the case of Quebec. Income tax remains a UK tax. It's the rates and the thresholds which will be devolved. So changing other aspects of the system around credits and so on, and using the tax system for welfare purposes will be much more difficult in Scotland than has been the case in Quebec. And the emphasis upon earned income is important here. So we have now a live debate within Scotland about whether the tax system, the new tax powers, should be used to increase the tax burden on higher earners in order to be more redistributive. My hunch is that that will be difficult to do in practice, partly because it's not altogether difficult to change the residence status of higher taxpayers, and you can also shift your earnings into unearned income if you are so inclined. So there are limitations there too. And finally, there are limitations on the public expectations of welfare. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's a desire, there may be a desire for self-government, but there's also a desire for commonality of service provision within Scotland. I think that's a toleration for policy divergence, but only if it means we get more. If the Scottish Government was to try to do something that was to shift resources perhaps away from one group and towards another, or away from cash benefits and towards services, I think that there would be quite a lot of kickback from that kind of position. And the rest of the UK would be the measure against which these things were judged. Of course, there are opportunities too. The last time I spoke in this room, I was asked to talk about the opportunities, which was much harder to do. Not because there aren't any, but just because maybe I'm just pessimistic by nature. But there are opportunities of scale. There are opportunities of partnership working, of networking. There are opportunities for policy innovation and experimentation. But I don't think we will see either a race to the top or a race to the bottom. I'm sure there will be innovations, but I think they will be more on the modest side, and I think there will be an awful lot of pressures facing the Scottish Government, whoever runs it in the future as these powers are devolved. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. We've got about 25 minutes for questions and discussion. Could I ask you to keep your contributions tight and to the point so that we can get as many people in as possible? I'll try to do what Guy did earlier and identify people in advance. So who wants to kick us off, please? Richard.
Hi, I'm Richard Parry, University of Edinburgh. I wonder if each of you could look at the other, as it were, because I think in each of the two interesting systems that we've heard about, you have one big player who is asking for more, shall we say, Quebec and Scotland asking for more within the system. So then the question is, what can they be offered? And what sort of consistency can there be? Because if you offer it to one within a system, you need to offer it to everybody else as well, to a certain degree. And that seems to have been, to some extent, what's been happening in Canada, I think, that what's offered to Quebec, to a certain extent, is not absolute, needs to be offered to everyone else. We've seen a little bit of that in Britain as well, in the UK, that what's been offered to Scotland is being offered to Wales, certainly, and what Wales has been responding is saying, we're not really interested because we are worse off. We perceive ourselves to be worse off. We aren't able to handle this. And so then you have a very awkward situation where you're saying, rather than saying people are asking for devolution and being told no, they're being told there's a devolution, it's on offer, and the people are not interested in it, the units are not interested in it. So are we looking at a big player within a system in each of the two cases, or are we looking at circumstances which are basically rather different?
Keith, you want to start off with that one?
Hi, Richard. Good question. There's no question in the Canadian context that Quebec's aspirations, sort of the national agenda in Quebec, has been the primary driver of decentralization in the Canadian case. And that by and large, what essentially happened is other provinces joined the camp in favor of decentralization. Took longer for them to come to that position, but they've joined it. And so I think the pressure in recent years has been stronger from Quebec, but supported by other provinces. So it's not been exclusively a Quebec-driven phenomenon. The interesting question in the Canadian case in this context is the level of asymmetry which has emerged, and the level of asymmetry the country seems to be willing to tolerate. And those are two separate questions. There has been, Quebec has carved out a larger role than other provinces in a number of areas. The Quebec pension plan is the biggest, but there are other areas of asymmetry. Immigration, settlement is a major one, which I didn't touch on here. And maternity and paternity benefits are the newest addition to the list. In each case, except the immigration case, but in the other two cases, the Quebec pension plan and the maternity paternity benefits, the official position of the Government of Canada is that other provinces can opt in to that devolution if they wish, and so far other provinces have not chosen to do so. In the case of the Canada pension plan, Alberta occasionally threatens. It's the one province which is occasionally threatened, and it is and it sometimes will threaten, especially if there's expansionist tendencies in other parts of the system. Alberta has a younger population, and therefore it tends to argue that being part of the Canada pension plan is actually a redistributive instrument to other parts of the system. And we all say, those of us living elsewhere say, yeah, okay. But Alberta occasionally threatens. So the level of asymmetry in the country in social policy is largely the product of other provinces deciding that they don't need to go there so far. That's on maternity, particularly maternity, paternity, and pensions. The one case of asymmetry which is not available to the other provinces has never been offered. It has to do with immigration, and in particular, the financial deal that Quebec got in its negotiations with the federal government in the aftermath of the collapse of the Meech Lake Accord, when the federal government was absolutely, let's put it this way, a highly motivated seller in the market in housing. The federal government really wanted to respond to the collapse of the Meech Lake Accord by having something. And the something they opted for was immigration settlement, and the Quebec government recognized the federal government's motivation and extracted an enormously attractive financial deal. Other provinces are quite resentful of that deal, but the federal government, especially Ontario, and the federal government has never made the offer to the other provinces. So we have that's the one area where you actually get clear resentment from other provinces about asymmetry, because it hasn't emerged in the traditional Canadian way.
I think that, yes, there are asymmetries in the Canadian case, but there are profound asymmetries in the UK. Most notably, not just between the devolved nations, but obviously in the continued absence of any form of self-government within England. Does that matter? I don't think so. I think that the evolution of the UK has always been able to cope with asymmetries in different parts of the kingdom, if you like, more easily than I think has been the case in Canada. I think that there's where resentment emerges, it's around fiscal transfers. And if you, I suppose that might in part drive the sort of a desire on one side, the two opposing positions, opposing starting points, but coming to a similar endpoint about fiscal autonomy. So desired from a self-government point of view in one part of the country, but pushed from a kind of offloading point of view in another, I guess. The one thing I didn't mention in the talk was about devolution in Northern Ireland, of course, which has always had social security devolution theoretically. But of course, we're seeing now the constraints upon the nature of the social security devolution and the link with fiscal transfers that has imposed, as you are well aware, Richard. So I think there have always been asymmetries in the UK. I don't think they lead to that sort of catch-up effect or the café para todos effect that you have seen in parts of Spain as well. As you said, the pressure, yes, from the UK point of view is to pass on some of these, particularly tax policies in Wales, where they don't particularly want them. So I'm not quite sure what's driving that at the central level, but that's, I suppose, quite new. But I think the dynamics in each of the parts of the UK are driven by different things, and they're more internal. And I think the responses usually have been separate and distinctive as well.
Could I just add a footnote? I think part of the problem in Canada as compared to the UK is that whereas the UK thinks of itself as a union of nations, separate countries, Canada, outside of Quebec, has difficulty, has traditionally had difficulty thinking that way about the country, and therefore we have asymmetry, but it's not fully legitimate. And so one of the ways I put it is Canadians are willing to accept asymmetry in practice, but please don't raise it to the level of principle.
Yes, please.
My name is Yinka Odumakin from Nigeria. I want to get your view from the experiences from Canada and Britain. It's clear that we're dealing with a challenge of self-determination, and we are torn between welfare and warfare. If you deny people the right to self-determination, you are incurring warfare. Yes, there's a social responsibility to ensure that the welfare of all citizens are guaranteed. Now, is the goal to make all fingers equal, or to ensure that all fingers are well fed?
Nicola.
I'll let you start.
Thanks for that. I mean, to be honest, I think that in a way that's not for me to say. I mean, those are political choices that would have to be made and debated in that context. So I can't answer that question directly about the relative importance, but I suppose it's important that there's a system that is designed to facilitate those choices, that allows those choices to be made at whichever level. And I think if I can bring it to a sort of multi-level government perspective, in a sense, I would throw back a question to you and say, in making those choices, does it matter at which level that service is provided? And maybe it links both to the question of whether one level has more capacity to do it than another.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understand the question. Is the question the balance between the pursuit of a sort of basic welfare for all, sort of making sure everyone's fed, and a larger conception of equality? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't think that I think I would be in the same place as Nicola here. I don't think that whether Canada is a federation, a centralized federation, a decentralized federation, fundamentally fundamentally drives the primary goals of social policy. Those are set in a larger cultural context, and in the Canadian context, we have, I think, have had a kind of equality of opportunity as a goal. That's been the predominant goal. It has meant that we have sought to make sure that everyone, to use your phrase, is fed. That is, there's kind of anti-poverty tradition in the country, coupled with an equality of opportunity conception of equality. We have never, as a society, been committed to the proposition that we should have equality of economic outcomes. But I don't think those choices we have made have been driven by our federal nature. They've been driven much more by the kind of political culture and political economy that emerged, particularly in a North American context.
Jim Gallagher, University of Glasgow again. Two questions which may be related. The first is, Nicola touched upon very briefly the demographic issue here. And one of the most striking things about welfare expenditure all across the Western world is that the pensioners are eating it all. Okay? And one can see that lots of the drivers for less welfare spend is actually increased welfare spend in the form of pensions. I'd be interested to know, particularly in the Canadian case, is that driving the set of changes, and is it more important, perhaps, than some of the political issues that we see? And the second, which may be related, is a question for Nicola. Nicola, you slightly skated over what I think is potentially the most interesting bit of the Scotland Act, Scotland Bill. Yeah, and I take absolutely no responsibility for this. I'm wholly innocent of it. But that is this notion of a top-up welfare system. Because one of the interesting things about welfare is that it's not merely a nation-building proposition, it's also a risk-sharing proposition. So you're sharing economic risk, and you're sharing, of course, demographic risk, which, and the two, of course, are connected, because if your young people leave because you're sharing economic risk, you're left with the demographic risk behind. And what's on offer, it would seem, almost out of the blue in the Scotland Bill, is the idea that you can maintain social cohesion and social rights across the UK territory, but you can then add something to them. And let's, leaving aside the technicalities of how top-up works, you're offering, as it were, a social union plus. Is that a good or a bad idea?
Two for the price of one, Jim, not for the first time. Keith, please.
Well, I'll certainly leave the second one to Nicola. There's no question the demographic pressures are intense, and they will become more intense. In 2011 was the year in which the dependency ratio was at its very lowest in Canada, and it rises very rapidly now. So we're just now in the transition, and within 10 years we will be getting close to peak. The demographic transition works in a very interesting way in terms of federalism. You mentioned pensions. In fact, the Canadian pension system is in relatively good shape and will weather the demographic transition better than in many countries. This is partly because the contributory system, the Canada Pension Plan, made changes in the late 1990s to increase contributions in that period, to invest that money in equities, and therefore the actuaries actually tell us it's in reasonable shape to handle the transition. There's another component, a flat rate old age security program and top-up, which is paid out of general revenues, but it's indexed to prices, not wages, and most people think the pension system is not going to be where the real pressure is going to be. The real pressure where we are not in good shape is the healthcare system, which will have all of those demographic pressures, but we do not have in place either the structure, the personnel, or the resources to cope. The interesting thing is that with the exception of Quebec, the pension system is federal. The healthcare system is provincial. And the one way of thinking about what went on in the 1990s, particularly on federal provincial transfers, is the federal government moved to a position to inoculate itself from demographic pressures, and it's the provinces that are going to bear the weight. And as I showed, fiscal transfers from the federal government to the provincial government are relatively small compared to other federations. And the really interesting politics of demographic change will be, can the provinces gang up on the federal government well enough to get more fiscal transfers for healthcare? That will be undoubtedly the biggest issue implicit in demographic change in Canada.
Just very briefly, I agree with you on your pensioners' point. I think intergenerational inequality is a major problem, and it's one that politicians of all colours in all parts of the UK seem to be unwilling to engage with. On your main question directed to me around top-up benefits, and we know where it came. I mean, that was in the Smith Commission report, so it didn't make it into the original draft clauses, but it did make it into the bill. I'm not going to make a value judgment as to whether it's a good or a bad idea. I think if I was a policy maker or someone who was charged with making policy, I'd much rather have design tools than spending tools. Or I'd rather have both, I suppose. But I suppose a risk associated with it is that rather than sharing risks, it becomes an illustration of what we talked about in both of the presentations of offloading. So I think the pressure may come more in the case of where a reserved benefit, UK-wide benefit, is cut or constrained or modified in some way as to reduce the scope of entitlement. Then the pressure would come, I think, to fill that gap that was created. So for a Scottish Government to intervene to take up that space. That's an example of offloading in a sense. It's also very difficult. Sorry?
Not an example of offloading. They're taking the pain in England.
Well, they are taking the pain. Yeah, well, yes, but they're not. It's from one government to another, in a sense. But it's a choice. It's a choice, a political choice to be made, whether you do that or not. I think it's probably not sustainable in the longer run, and it's not altogether clear if. Well, I think it's phrased in the bill as a short term. I'm not quite sure. I need to double check the wording, but it's not altogether clear that having topped up, you could then reduce further down the line if you chose to. So that element of it is not clear to me. So I would worry about the long-term sustainability of that provision. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. It's a limited thing, I suppose.
I could take one short question and two short answers. David.
Hi, David Bell, University of Stirling. It's really a question for Keith, and it's about inequality in Canada and how you think about it. I guess it's a bit of a question about geography. It does seem to me to be very important to distinguish between pre-tax and post-tax inequality. And if you're thinking about the UK, in terms of pre-tax inequality, the geographic distribution or division that you'd think about would be London versus the rest of the UK. Once you get to post-tax, then Scotland will have its own powers and may be able to influence the distribution of income within Scotland. And my question, I guess, is it appropriate to think of both pre-tax and post-tax within the same political framework, or maybe should you be thinking about Toronto, Vancouver driving to some extent the levels of inequality in Canada?
Keith.
absolutely right on that you have to consider pre-tax and post-tax. And if you're thinking about those in geographic terms, then it's very clear that there's significant interregional differences in inequality, and that the system only reduces those in part. Should we be thinking of the drivers as cities as opposed to provinces? Was that the heart of your question? It's a really interesting question because Canada is like many places. Cities drive, the economies of cities drive much, but constitutionally, cities are left out. They have no constitutional status. They are creatures of the provinces. And all our serious intergovernmental relations and fiscal relations are between the federal government and the provinces and the territories. And cities have always complained that they're left out of that process. And so it's interesting, given what you've just said, it's interesting the extent to which the concepts we use to think about interregional inequality are driven by the constitutional frame that we use rather than the lived experience that we live. So I think we will probably continue to think about it in provincial rather than urban terms, even though that misses a lot of what's driving things.
Quick comment, Nicola? Nope. Thank you very much indeed. We're now just at 1:15, not by the RSE clock, but by my watch, which is what we're living by just for the moment. So we've had, I think, a splendid session, both informative and very stimulating. And I'd like you to show your appreciation to the speakers in the usual way.
That was fun.
And if you could be back in your seats by 1:45, that would be greatly appreciated by the next person to occupy this seat. Thank you.